Good evening. My name is Layla Ilaraza, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues here at Dickinson College. On behalf of the Clark Forum and the Departments of Political Science and Spanish and Portuguese Studies, the Law and Policy Program, and Sigma Lambda Beta, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Puerto Rico, the 51st state, explaining the diminished prospects for Puerto Rico statehood. I'd like to ask you all to silence cell phones and electronic devices. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. In the event of an emergency, note that accessible exits are located through the double doors behind you and to the right at the end of the hallway. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to recognize that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We hereby recognize the prior status and enduring diversity of this land and the many indigenous nations that stand in relation to it, particularly the thousands of indigenous children from dozens of tribes forced into the reprogramming camp established at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879. Dickinson College supported this agenda of cultural eradication in both word and deed. Turning honestly toward that shameful past animates this acknowledgement and gives orientation to our desire for a reconciled future. Accordingly, this living land acknowledgement is incomplete by design, a reflection of the ongoing process it represents. To learn respectfully from the stories of this land and the peoples that carry them, to think reflectively about the injustice in our shared past, and to act responsibly with that knowledge today to inspire a more equitable tomorrow. I would like to also highlight that tonight's event was student-initiated. At the beginning of every semester, the Clark Forum's student project managers propose ideas for programs focused on contemporary issues. We then vote to select the top 2 proposals to develop for the following semester. I proposed this program last semester because of the personal connection I feel to the topic and a lack of understanding and knowledge in the United States about Puerto Rico's political history, especially in relation to the US. My grandfather was born in Fajardo, Puerto Rico in the 1940s to a line of sugarcane farmers. As sugarcane production on the island diminished, my grandfather and his family moved to the US mainland in search of work. My abuelita's family, originally from Cayey, has a similar story. La Gran Migración, the Great Migration of Puerto Ricans from the island to the mainland in search of economic opportunities, led my grandparents to the Bronx, where they met and started a family. Growing up, I was close with both grandparents and relished learning about their lives back in Puerto Rico. Both grandparents still hold the island close in their hearts, and I cherish the stories about the abrasive tropical weather, our elders' home still on the island, celebrating Dia de Reyes, and their memories of the food, climate, and culture. In 2017, Hurricane Maria ravaged the island, killing thousands and leaving behind billions of dollars of destruction. My great-grandmother, Mama Danita, survived the hurricane and came to live with my grandfather in the US. My interactions with Mama Danita, witnessing how much she loved and missed home, and seeing the lack of federal response to the hurricane renewed my interest in Puerto Rican politics, especially in relation to the United States. Though my family history helped me connect with the island and understand its significance, my research and witness of tragedy and a stunted US response to that national tragedy made me realize and question the status of the island and its complexities, especially with regards to nationalism and statehood. Tonight, Dr. Carlos Vargas-Ramos will discuss the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico, the lack of political and social motives for decolonization, and the varying perspectives and barriers to statehood. Dr. Vargas-Ramos is an adjunct associate professor of political science at Columbia University and the director of public policy, external and media relations, and development at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. As a social scientist, he teaches immigration, race and ethnicity, and urban politics. He has studied migration's impact on Puerto Rican political behavior and issues presented by racial identity within the Puerto Rican community. He is the editor of Race Front and Center, Perspectives on Race Among Puerto Ricans, and has authored articles such as Political Crisis, Migration and Electoral Behavior, and Puerto Ricans, Citizens and Migrants, A Cautionary Tale. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carlos Vargas-Ramos.
Buenas tardes, good evening. Before I begin my lecture today, I want to thank the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College and its directors, Professors Angie Fankuchen and Anthony Sorvino, for their kind invitation to come and speak with you about the status of Puerto Rico and the possibility of it becoming the 51st State of the Union. I also like to thank Sarah Moskowitz for making possible my arrival here at Dickinson College, and the students' program managers for selecting the topic and for selecting me to deliver the lecture that I am going to be delivering for you today, in particularly Laila y La Raza and all the work that they have done in putting this program together tonight. And I said that I want to speak with you because even though we'll be doing some lecturing, I certainly want to engage in a conversation with you, certainly during the Q&A period. In my presentation, I will discuss the nature of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States, the historical process of incorporation of U.S. territories into the Union, the partisan reasons why Congress may not want to incorporate Puerto Rico as a state, the political reasons why a solid majority of residents of Puerto Rico may still not want Puerto Rico to become a U.S. state, the economic, racial, cultural obstacles for Congress to admit Puerto Rico as a state, and the international context that provides little incentive for Puerto Rico's decolonization. I'll cut to the chase and conclude that the chances of Puerto Rico joining the Union as a member in equal standing as any other of the 50 states at present are slim to non-existent. But in order to explain why I conclude this, I need to trace the reasons why this is so, beginning with why it is the U.S. Congress has to intervene at all. This means that I need to provide a bit of history and institutional context. Why is Puerto Rico the subject of the attention of Congress? Why may the people of Puerto Rico want to join the U.S. as a state? As you may know, Puerto Rico is a territorial possession of the United States. It's a colony, it is property. And Puerto Rico has been a colony of the United States for 126 years, since 1898, when Spain, under the terms of the Treaty of Paris, transferred the sovereignty over Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam to the U.S. after Spain lost the Cuban-Spanish-American War. And why is Congress the arm of the U.S. government that with immediate oversight of Puerto Rico? Because the Constitution of the United States grants Congress that power. Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution states that the Congress shall have the power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or any other property belonging to the United States. And Congress has exercised its power on many occasions, including as recently as 2016 with the Promesa Law, which created a fiscal management and oversight board appointed by Congress and the President with the power to limit the expenditures of the government of Puerto Rico and approves its budget as a result of the territorial government's insolvency. For the purposes of our conversation, Today, there are 3 additional significant moments Congress exercised power over Puerto Rico, in addition to the creation of the Fiscal Management and Oversight Board, by passing laws that organized the civilian government that had ruled the territory since 1900, and which extended greater measures of self-government. And I'm referring here to the Foraker Act of 1900, the Jones Act of 1917, the Puerto Rico Federal Affairs Act of 1950. Organizing a civilian government was an important step in the institutional development of any territory of the United States, any territory under the jurisdiction of the United States. Article 4, Section 3, Clause 1 of the Constitution also gives power to Congress to admit new states into the Union. And although the Constitution does not prescribe the requirements needed for a territory to become a state, by and large, legislation passed by Congress at times called for a territory to have, number one, sufficient population, to have sufficient size, and to be organized politically, which is why the organization of a civilian government facilitated by the Foraker Act and the Jones Act, as well as the Public Law 600, are pertinent. Territories also needed the capacity to finance their own government before being admitted as states. In fact, the first legislation that governed the political organization and admissions of territories as states, which were the Land Ordinances of 1784 or the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, preceded the creation of the United States. Since then, Congress has admitted 32 territories, and I specify territories because the United States has admitted state entities that were other than territories between 1791 and 1959. There remain 5 territories under the purview of Congress that remain territories: American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. There are also a number of other territorial possessions of the United States known collectively as U.S. minor outlying areas, but these are largely uninhabited. But while Congress may have stipulated some objective indicators by which to determine whether a territory may be satisfactorily admitted as a state, there may be other considerations for admission that may not be as apparent. If you see this timeline of territories being admitted into the Union after the founding of the Republic, you may notice that there is a slight correlation between the year of admission as a state and the percentage of the population in that territory that was white in the decennial census preceding admission. However, that correlation becomes much more robust when you consider the territories that were admitted after the Civil War. So the fact that you have the territories that had the lowest percentage of white residents after the Civil War were the ones who tended to be admitted last. These data points suggest that there was another factor for admission not spelled out in the statehood process, that the socially, economically, and politically dominant group in the territory needed to be non-Hispanic whites before Congress would consider admitting it. Moreover, the experience of territories of Oklahoma, New Mexico, Alaska, and Hawaii are testament to not simply the role of racial considerations in the process of admissions of state, but specifically the cultural and ethnic dimensions so closely related to the racial makeup of the territories in question. This consideration can be discerned in the stipulations for incorporation of territories newly acquired by the United States. As the United States acquired territory in its expansion southwards and westward, U.S. citizenship was extended to the residents of those territories who fit for citizenship, that is, white persons. Therefore, the treaties that brought Spanish East and Spanish West Florida and the Louisiana territories and the territories belonging to Mexico all stipulated that the inhabitants of those territories would be incorporated into the United States as citizens, okay, and to be done so as soon as possible. Okay. However, by the time Mexicans, formerly Mexican territories, were under the purview of the United States, the call for Mexican subjects to be admitted into the United States was not done as soon as possible, but at a proper time to be judged by the Congress of the United States. So here we see that the United States Congress is already equivocating about the admission of newly incorporated peoples as citizens. However, by the time Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam were acquired by the United States from Spain as a price of war, incorporation into the United States was no longer automatic nor even guaranteed by the U.S. Rather, such incorporation was now wholly subject to the will and whim of the U.S. Congress, as you see in these stipulations by the treaties that brought Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, as well as the U.S. Virgin Islands, where the status of the inhabitants of the islands shall be determined by the Congress, indeterminately. Okay. However, Congress was not the institution that established the tenor of the relationship between Puerto Rico and other territories and the United States. Instead, it was the U.S. Supreme Court in its jurisprudence collectively known as the Insular cases that created the legal justification for the present colonial relationship. What is operative for the present discussion is that the court made a distinction between what it determined were incorporated from unincorporated territories of the United States. The territories acquired from Spain and later Denmark were deemed to belong to the United States, but were not considered to be part of the United States. Congress would therefore treat these territories differently from states, for instance, circumventing the uniformity clause of the Constitution, or by not extending all of the protections of the Bill of Rights to the territories. And the territories were therefore, as property, subject to the plenary powers of the United States. And therefore, Congress could decide whether to admit those territories as states on equal standing with other states. It could equally dispose of those territories by either granting them independence or selling them, or by keeping them indefinitely. So far, the United States has decided to keep Puerto Rico as an unincorporated territory for the past 126 years. Another consideration to keep in mind when thinking about the process of incorporation and admission of a territory is the impact that admission may have on the balance of political power in the United States Congress. As you may very well know, the initial compromise between the states in constituting the Federal Republic hinged on the issue of slavery. As territories were admitted into the Union as states on equal standing with each other, a balance was struck so that admission would not provide an advantage to those on one side of the issue of slavery and those on the other. And you can think of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 concerning the territories acquired through the Louisiana Purchase, the Compromise of 1850, largely concerning the territories acquired through the war with Mexico, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, or the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. After the Civil War, the political power balance in Congress was determined on the basis of partisanship, That is, whether a territory would add to the strength of the Republicans or Democrats in Congress. After Reconstruction, the consensus was one of partisan balance in Congress as territories were admitted as states. So that of the 13 territories admitted as states since the end of the Civil War, 8 were admitted as Republican, 5 were admitted as Democrats. Returning to the issue of the plenary powers of Congress over the territories contained in the Territory Clause of the Constitution, Congress exercised these plenary powers by creating civilian governments in Puerto Rico. It did so with a tutelary or gradual approach in the extension of the right of self-government to the people of Puerto Rico, because Congress was not of the opinion that the people of Puerto Rico could govern themselves, but rather had to be instructed in the ways of Republican self-government. This approach notwithstanding the fact that the residents of Puerto Rico already had a fairly expansive form of self-government under the autonomy Spain had granted it in 1897, just prior to the Cuban-Spanish-American War. In 1900, the government of Puerto Rico was transitioned from military rule to one in which voters in Puerto Rico could elect its lower chamber of the legislature, the House of Delegates, while the President of the United States appointed the delegates to an executive council that operated as an upper chamber of the legislature. It was appointed, the President also appointed the territory's governor. In 1917, Congress allowed the residents of Puerto Rico to elect not only the members of the lower chamber of the legislature, but also the members of the upper chamber. The governor, however, continued to be appointed by the president. In 1947, Congress passed a law allowing the voters in Puerto Rico to elect their own governor. And then finally, in 1950, Congress allowed the people of Puerto Rico to draft their own constitution in conformity with all applicable federal law and the Constitution of the United States. To underscore the nature of the colonial relation between Puerto Rico and the United States, however, the United States Supreme Court issued a decision in 2016 which ruled that Puerto Rico's source of sovereignty derived from Congress, and the grants of sovereignty Congress had decided to extend to Puerto Rico fall under its plenary powers. And they reside on these cases from the Supreme Court, again, collectively known as the Insular cases, right? So the Insular cases are the ones that create the distinction between incorporated territories and unincorporated territories, but also in another judicial decision whereby the Supreme Court acknowledges the right of Congress to act in a manner that Congress wants to act with hardly any restrictions, but the restrictions that may exist in the Constitution itself still apply to the case of Puerto Rico when the Congress of the United States extended U.S. citizenship to the residents of Puerto Rico. And here, the case in question was whether the extension of U.S. citizenship to the residents of Puerto Rico was equal to incorporating Puerto Rico into the Union. Not quite as a state, but as a shifting from being an unincorporated territory to being an incorporated territory. And the Supreme Court said no. Puerto Rico remains an unincorporated territory. The fact that the U.S. Congress, under its plenary powers, decided to extend U.S. citizenship to Puerto Rico did not mean that Puerto Rico was incorporated. Moreover, the Supreme Court decided that Puerto Ricans were not receiving the same rights as U.S. citizens, not because they were Puerto Ricans, but because they lived in Puerto Rico. And because Puerto Rico was an unincorporated territory, that's what made the people who were in Puerto Rico subject to that unequal treatment. And the Supreme Court highlighted it by saying that what is determinative is the application of, is the locality that is the key here. So any U.S. citizen that happens to be in Puerto Rico will still be subject to the same unequal treatment. Okay? Not just Puerto Ricans. And we can certainly talk more about this aspect of Puerto Rican citizenship, whether it is a second-class citizenship or not, during the Q&A. But insofar as the treatment, or we could also talk about perhaps whether, even though the Supreme Court was adamant that no, Puerto Ricans are not second-class citizens, it's just that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory which can be treated differently. We can also talk about whether the treatment of Puerto Ricans in the United States proper, which is a right that granted Puerto Ricans, Puerto Ricans could now travel back and forth freely between Puerto Rico and the United States proper, whether the incorporation of those Puerto Ricans in the United States was evidence of second-class treatment. Right? We can discuss that in the Q&A. Puerto Rico has been a colony, general, since it was incorporated into the imagination of the Western world in 1493. The political issue that has animated politics in Puerto Rico since the last quarter of the 19th century has been the nature of the relationship between that Puerto Rico maintains with its colonial power, whether that colonial power has been Spain or the United States. The tendencies involved has historically been independence from its colonial master, an achievement of sovereignty, annexation into the colonial power on conditions of equal footing, or the greatest measure of autonomy within a subordinate position vis-a-vis the colonial power. Politics on a left and right or liberal and conservative axis have conformed to the politics of status, with independence seen as a more progressive or radical option, annexation as the most conservative, with autonomy in the middle, whereas a middle road position, albeit with some radical or more centrist variants, depending on the case. Although I must stress that this understanding has scrambled during the past 2 decades, and we can discuss further during the Q&A, because some people now see annexation as a progressive alternative, whereas autonomy is seen as a more conservative position. But we can discuss that further. Partisan politics along a democratic-republican dimension do not resonate in Puerto Rico, period, since they do not conform to the status politics that dominate the political system in Puerto Rico. There are local branches of the Democrat and Republican parties in Puerto Rico, but they do not contest elections or the elections of the Commonwealth government. They only contest elections during the primary process for the nomination of U.S. presidential candidates, and this has been the case since the 1980s. Despite this marginal presence in local Puerto Rican politics, some political insiders in Puerto Rico, as well as activists from the major local political parties, do participate in the political operations of the major U.S. political parties, with advocates for statehood, that is annexation, split between the Democrats and Republican parties, while some of the advocates of Commonwealth status engaging in Democratic Party politics. Pro-independents, by and large, do not become involved in U.S. party politics on principle. As in the United States, turnout in primary elections is generally much lower in party primary elections than during turnout during general elections. And Puerto Rico is no different. However, turnout of registered voters in primary elections for U.S. parties is much lower than turnout in primaries for local political parties. For local political parties, the cumulative turnout rates range from around 1/5 of registered voters. For U.S. Political parties, turnout has fluctuated. So we see that, for instance, in the primary elections for the National Democratic Party, the turnout was about 16%, but not close to the 20% or 22% for the local party primaries. And then it dropped to 3% and to less than 1% in the last two cycles. US party politics do not resonate in Puerto Rican politics. Same thing with Republican primaries. 5% in 2012 and 1.3% in 2016. And this contrasts tremendously because turnout of registered voters during the general elections had exceeded between 70 and 80% of registered voters in Puerto Rico. So for Puerto Rican elections, historically, certainly since the middle of the 20th century, turnout ranged between 70 and 80%. That's higher than in the United States. US party politics, therefore, do not generally transcend in Puerto Rico. Neither does participation of Puerto Rico in the primary process in the United States, since the primary elections in Puerto Rico tend to take place after Super Tuesday, when generally the outcomes of the nomination process for president has already been locked. Turning to the local partisan politics of Puerto Rico, for 20 years, since people in Puerto Rico have been able to vote for governor, the political system, while nominally a two-party system, maybe three, was dominated by the advocates of the current territorial Commonwealth status. Since 1968, however, there has been an alternation in power between the pro-Commonwealth Party and the pro-statehood Party. Participation in the electoral process during this period has been very high as a result of the legitimizing shine high turnout rates provide the regime, as well as the tightness of the electoral competition between the two major political parties. Moreover, the general elections to fill the elected positions of the government of Puerto Rico were often turned into quasi-plebiscites or referenda by the political parties, with a victory by one party or the other signifying tacit support for any given status option. Right? So, electoral outcomes in Puerto Rico are very tight, which contributes to explain this high participation rate. Right? The political parties in Puerto Rico are, or had been, until very recently, very effective mobilization machines. Right? We can talk about what happened in 2016 and 2020 when the participation rate dropped to 55%. We can talk a little bit about that later. But even though, as it is happening right now in the current election process, many of these local elections take the form almost of participating in the plebiscites. In Puerto Rico, there have been 6 plebiscites since 1952. Again, 1952 is the year that the Puerto Rican Constitution was approved by the people of Puerto Rico and approved by the Congress of the United States. Since then, there have been plebiscites in 1967, 93, 95, 98, actually just 98, 2012, 2017, and 2020. Okay? None of these referenda has had the congressional imprimatur the same way the creation of the Commonwealth government had. That is, Congress has not mandated it, or Congress has not subjected itself to the results of any of these plebiscites. There are nevertheless a number of clear facts about these expressions of sentiment of the Puerto Rican electorate around the status issue. First and foremost, the vast majority of Puerto Ricans, the Puerto Rican voters, do not want independence for Puerto Rico. We can see that the choice for independence does not muster 6%. The reverse is that the vast majority of people in Puerto Rico want to maintain some kind of a relationship with the United States, either as a state or as a territory, as a colony. This was at least the case until 2012. So let me explain this a little bit. In the results of these 1967 plebiscites were that, yes, the current territorial status Commonwealth, that was favored by the majority of the electorate. However, these results were subject to the fact that there was an actual boycott, certainly by the advocates of independence, which is why the results for independence were so low, and even some advocates of statehood. Right? So in Puerto Rico, boycott is a political strategy that has been used historically, known in Spanish as retraimiento, right? You subtract, you take away legitimacy from the results by not participating in the process that you find illegitimate. Right? But in 1993, we see that the options for statehood or Commonwealth were pretty even, right? With those advocating statehood independence at 4%, right? Something curious happened in 1998 because the advocates of statehood, who were in control of the political apparatus, the electoral apparatus at the time, did not include Commonwealth status as an option, which is why the majority of the people said they didn't want any of those choices above, right? So the option that won is none of these options, none of the above. In 2012, however, something very interesting happened. There was one election, but there were two questions. And this was very smart among the advocates of statehood. They asked one question: do you want Puerto Rico to continue to be a territory of the United States or not? So the majority of the voters said no. We do not want Puerto Rico to continue to be a colony of the United States. Why is that? Because the advocates of statehood and the advocates of independence got together and said, no more territory. Right? And if you add up many of these options historically, you see that that is what happens. Those who don't want Puerto Rico to become a state of the Union, that is, pro-Commonwealth supporters and pro-independence supporters, they get together, they veto, they block that out. Right? It's like a game of tic-tac-toe. Right? Those who don't want Commonwealth to continue, so that means statehood and independence, no, we don't want any more territory. And similarly, it's not very hard to oppose independence just because so many people in Puerto Rico oppose it already. But in 2012, it was clear that for the first time, the way they framed the question is territory, yes or no. The majority said no. And then in that same election, in a different question, they asked, well, what do you want? Commonwealth was not an option because it was just decided here. Then you have statehood, free association, and we can talk about what free association is, or independence. Right? And I'll explain to you momentarily what happens. Then, in 2017, there was another referendum in which statehood won by 97%. Wow. So it went from 46% to 61% to 97%. I'll explain what happened there. And then 2020, with 52% of the population now saying that they do, the electorate saying that they want statehood for Puerto Rico. I'll explain it here to a greater extent. These are the actual votes, not percentages. These are actual votes. Right? So we are looking at the election of 2012 and 2017 to begin with. In 2012, there were 2.4 million registered voters in Puerto Rico. 1.8 turned out to vote. 1.7 voted on that question, right? 1.7 million. What happened? So that question was decided. The majority said, no, we don't want Puerto Rico to be a territory. For question number 2, same 1.8 million ballots cast in the entire election, but only 1.3 million responded to this question. There was nearly 500,000 people who didn't vote for that second set of questions. A boycott of the question, right? Because there was such a difference, 400,000 votes between the two questions, the outcomes were framed as these results are indeterminate. Then the advocates of statehood said, well, we're going to have another plebiscite in 2017. That one was definitely opposed by both advocates of independence and advocates of territorial status, Commonwealth. And what happened? Instead of having 1.8 million people voting in that election, 500,000 people voted. So here the boycott was very clear. Right? And not only that, if in 2012 those favoring statehood were 834,000 people, it was only 500,000 in 2017. So even among the advocates of statehood, there were qualms about the process. Right? So that was 2012, 2017. But we have 2020. Right? And in 2020, something else happened. In 2012, curiously, I cannot explain it, the advocates of Commonwealth status did not even engage in a boycott. I'm talking about calling for a boycott, not just a simple abstention. Which is why those who favor statehood did get the most votes. The nature of the question was statehood, yes or no. Okay? And here you could say that yes, 53%. 53% of the votes, of the voters, voted for statehood, right? And that's where we are right now. There is another plebiscite in this election. We are not exactly sure what the outcome will be, but there is no question about the fact that even though you still did not have as many voters voting for statehood in 2020 as you did in 2012, there is a movement among the electorate, perhaps, in that direction. Since 2012, advocates for statehood for Puerto Rico have been lobbying the US Congress to authorize a referendum in Puerto Rico that binds Congress to the results, right? A binding referendum. However, Congress has no appetite to consider this Puerto Rico status question. According to the Puerto Rico Status Archives project at the University of Connecticut at Storrs, 48 bills have been introduced in either the U.S. House of Representatives or the U.S. Senate since 1989. 48. None has passed Congress. Congress does not want to address the question. Congress does not want to touch the issue. So to some extent, there is no boycott among the advocates of Commonwealth status or even independence because they're counting on the Congress to disregard whatever outcome. A reliance on the principle of parity on the one hand and of political equality and equal treatment for U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico are driving the advocacy for statehood in Puerto Rico, particularly as it respects prodding the U.S. Congress to address the island status question. This approach, based on a self-righteous demand for equal treatment by granting U.S. citizens of the territory statehood, may play well among a small majority of the electorate in Puerto Rico, but it neglects the political dimensions of admissions to the Union as they play out in Washington, D.C. That is, what is happening in Puerto Rico with these plebiscites is not resonating in Congress. There is no actual interest in the Congress of the United States to address the issue of Puerto Rico status. There is no impending crisis affecting the United States that will force the United States government to address the issue of Puerto Rico status, as there may have existed after the Second World War with the advent of the push for the decolonization worldwide, or the deepening of the superpower Cold War. Moreover, there is little incentive to respond to a petition from Puerto Rico for admission to the Union as a state, and there are substantial political reasons why such a petition would not be taken up, and these are the reasons why. If Puerto Rico were to become a state, it would have more representation in the U.S. House of Representatives than 21 states of the Union. With all the attendant political weight such representation may bring to the island in Congress, particularly as it respects to the distribution of federal funding. Moreover, of the approximately 4 members of the House of Representatives Puerto Rico may be entitled to, based on population, at minimum 3, if not all 4, prospective representatives are likely to be Democrats, eliciting Republican opposition in admitting such a state with an overwhelming Democratic state. And underscoring this point, there is no other territory that may be admitted along with Puerto Rico that may balance this Democratic predominance in order to keep the balance of power in the Congress. The population of Washington, D.C., the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, or American Samoa numbers in the hundreds of thousands, far too small compared to the 3.2 million people who reside in Puerto Rico. Furthermore, these territories that I just mentioned also are either solidly Democrat or lean towards the Democratic Party, underscoring the Republican opposition to it. In addition, there will be little appetite among Republicans in Congress to admit a territory that is so reliant on federal funding for its population's well-being, as the Republican current political project entails reducing the size of government and furthering the role of states in the administration of government. And Puerto Rico is currently under a fiscal crisis with a board appointed by the Congress of the United States because Puerto Rico's government is insolvent. It cannot pay its debts. And that debt needs to be restructured. And that is why the federal court in Puerto Rico is involved. Therefore, that principle of meeting its financial obligations really undercuts any argument the advocates of statehood may have for Puerto Rico. There are some additional financial considerations to take into account. Puerto Rico's historical and current situation does not make it a very attractive candidate for statehood under these circumstances. These political reasons, both partisan and institutional, should be enough to account for the very low probability that Congress will admit Puerto Rico into the Union in the short term or even in the foreseeable future. However, one possibility might still provide a probability of consideration of statehood for Puerto Rico, because if you think of the fact that even though Puerto Rico or Puerto Ricans are thought of in the United States as being supporters of the Democrats, in terms of political culture, the Puerto Rican electorate behaves like Southern Democrats. That is, culturally, socially conservative, and economic progressives or populists, right? Which may provide an opening for the Republican Party to try to tap onto that electorate. But this is more of a long-term prospect that requires a specific type of framing by the advocates of statehood and the interests of the US Republican Party in engaging in that effort. Then there is the ethno-cultural component. Puerto Rico is 99% Hispanic, with Puerto Ricans born in Puerto Rico making up 93% of the 3.2 million people residing on the island. An additional 4% are Puerto Ricans born in the United States. And only 1/4 of Puerto Rico's population speaks English very well or exclusively, which means that more than 3/4 do not speak English better than well. They don't reach that well level. It is self-reflected, it is self-reported. Doesn't mean that that is not the case, but in terms of self-reporting, most Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico do not speak English. Language and culture considerations were an impediment for New Mexico statehood, and Hispanos in that territory did not represent the majority of the population of the state of New Mexico. At best, Hispanos in New Mexico represented about 40 or 45% of New Mexico population at the time of admission. Puerto Rico is 99% Hispanic. With all of these factors mitigating against the possibility of Puerto Rico becoming a state of the Union in the short term is why I conclude that the chances of Puerto Rico joining the Union as a member in equal standing as any of the other 50 states at present is slim to non-existent. Thank you. And I'll be happy to take your questions.
Oh, just a second. It's now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. And we do reserve the first question for students.
Okay, can you hear me? Hi.
Yes.
Hi. Earlier you said that Congress did not want to touch the question about Puerto Rico becoming a state. How do you think that they responded to in 2019 when Donald Trump wanted to get Greenland instead of Puerto Rico? Like he wanted to trade out Greenland for Puerto Rico. How do you think Congress responded to that?
Nothing happened. Maybe people in Congress took it as, well, this is another thing that Trump says, right? But it is a possibility because Puerto Rico is a territory. It's an unincorporated territory. If the US Congress wanted to swap Puerto Rico for Greenland, it could do it. It can. Will it? That would be, you're going to get rid of 3.2 US citizens for Greenland. And what happened with all this? We are going to educate this population in our own image. We're going to teach them democracy. It is a showcase of democracy and capitalistic development in the Caribbean. It could do it. It has the legal power to do it. Congress is not interested. There are more pressing issues in the Congress of the United States than the issue of the territories, any of the territories. Right now, Congress is the arm of the government that has direct oversight of the territories. But Congress doesn't even collect, through the Census Bureau, the same amount of information through surveys or even the decennial census that it collects for the 50 states. So it doesn't even have the same level of information to make public policy around the territories that it does for the 50 states, which results in two things, either bad policy or no policy. Any questions? There's a question here.
The slide says that, like no impending external crisis or pressure has like Congress considering adding Puerto Rico as a U.S. state, but is there anything that like would have them to consider, like any crisis?
In the past, the creation of Commonwealth status came about because, again, this is 1950, 1951, 1952. This is the height of the decolonization movement worldwide, in Africa, in Asia, etc. So there was that pressure upon the United States to decolonize its colonies, right? The Congress argued before the UN that by granting Puerto Rico greater autonomy, by letting it craft its own constitution, by approving in a referendum its own constitution, by Congress voting on that constitution, that it was giving Puerto Rico self-determination. And therefore, the case of decolonization was done with. But as late as 2022 or 2016, the Supreme Court said Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States subject to the plenary powers of the Congress. So that's one reason. The other reason is Puerto Rico, when I made the allusion about Puerto Rico being a showcase of democracy and capitalistic development, is because during this period, at the height of the Cold War, the competition between communist and socialist countries with Western democracy, capitalistic countries, Puerto Rico was seen as we are a model, so people in Latin America would not follow the Cuban path. Those pressures don't exist. And again, there is no other territory in the portfolio of property of the United States that would allow the Congress to say, okay, well, let's get rid of colonies and let's admit them all, but they have to have the same political weight in the Congress of the United States. That does not exist. So that's what I mean. There is no pressure. And there is no internal insurgency in Puerto Rico. Puerto Ricans are not raised up in arms anymore, fighting for independence or decolonization or what have you. Okay? And certainly if that were to be the case, it would be for independence, not statehood.
Could you explain more about what free association is?
Yes. Free association is, and there are several definitions. Free association is a status that currently exists in the Northern Mariana Islands. That is, there is a political relationship between the Marianas and the United States. But they're not part of the United States, although they maintain, they can carry a US national passport or what have you. It is, in the context of Puerto Rican politics, almost like a status between territory and independence. It's a status where either side, either Puerto Rico or Congress, would say, okay, enough, go your own way, or we'll go our own way. Right? So it is presumably also a way to decolonize Puerto Rico without ending up with independence.
We have time for 2 more questions. So.
This isn't really related to politics, but what do you think is going to happen to the culture of Puerto Rico if it becomes the 51st state?
What would happen to the culture of Puerto Rico if it were to become the 51st state? Well, you see it right now. Puerto Rico has been a colony of the United States for 126 years. It is eminently a Spanish Caribbean culture. The vast majority of the people still speak Spanish. The outlook is Latin American by and large, but there is still a strong cultural attachment to the United States. Right? Between 1900 and the 1930s, there was an attempt by the government of the United States to, quote unquote, Americanize Puerto Ricans, where the language of instruction was English, where children were taught in English in an effort to turn them into Americans. But it did not pan out. It did not pan out. There is a stronger pressure happening presently that comes from social media, culture. It's exactly, where there's the children are speaking English just by watching TV or not TV, not TV, but the movies, programming, social media, etc., and communicating among themselves in English oftentimes, right? Were Puerto Rico to become a state, first of all, I cannot fathom it for these reasons. For these reasons, not because, for these reasons. I don't see how much different it would be. Also because the vast majority of people in Puerto Rico are Hispanic, and it's 3.2 million. Puerto Rico is one of the most densely populated countries in the world. So it's not like many people who are not Puerto Rican or many people who are not Hispanics are going to move to Puerto Rico. And that's a fear that you see nowadays expressed in the press, where you see many people from outside buying houses, particularly along the coasts. And there is a fear in Puerto Rico that Puerto Ricans are being displaced, right? But I, again, underscore the fact that of the 3.2 million people in Puerto Rico, 92% are Puerto Ricans born in Puerto Rico. Another 3 or 4% Puerto Ricans born in the United States.
You said that the U.S. could at any time say that they want the relationship to end. So what factors are stopping the U.S. from wanting that relationship to end?
That's a headache too. That's a headache. A superpower who could not make these people want to be Americans. That can be embarrassing, right? They don't want us? Wow. And you also have to understand that Puerto Rico still serves a purpose. The reason why the United States acquired Puerto Rico was for its strategic location. That has not changed. If you look at where Puerto Rico is and the U.S. Virgin Islands are, they are on the northeast corner of the Caribbean Sea, controlling the shipping lanes from the Panama Canal to Northern Europe. Right? You can either do it through the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, or you could do it from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. That's on the channel. But Puerto Rico is right there. So it provides the United States with a military base, which is the reason why the United States acquired Hawaii, Guam, the Marianas, right? Guantanamo, right? These are all reasons why the United States wanted to have those territories, because they were coaling or refueling stations, right? It would be a headache. And again, there is no incentive to get rid of it. People in Puerto Rico are not anymore fighting with arms to free themselves. right? There was a moment when that was happening. The previous attack on Congress, where members of Congress were hurt, were by Puerto Rican nationalists in 1950. One of the attempts on the President of the United States was by Puerto Rican nationalists. That's not happening. There is no pressure on the Congress to act.
We can do one more.
So if any of this is so impossible, especially I think independence seems like the least likely option just because the fiscal problems alone, why is that, or what's the driving force behind that aspect of all this? Why are people still so convinced that like that's the right option?
Which option?
The independence. Sorry if that was unclear.
Oh, but independence is not an option for most people in Puerto Rico. Less than 6%, right? Puerto Ricans do not see that as an option. Now, advocates of independence will tell you that there is not a lot of support for independence in Puerto Rico because Puerto Ricans are scared. And Puerto Ricans are scared because they feel that they're going to be poor, that they're going to be like Jamaica or the Dominican Republic or some of the other quote-unquote republics around it. And they don't want to lose that purchasing power or ability, right? And mind you, Puerto Rico right now has a very high rate of poverty. 43%, the portion of the population of Puerto Rico living below the poverty level is 43%. That is twice as much as the 3 poorest states of the Union, New Mexico, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and 3 times as high as the US poverty level as a whole. So there is that fear. There is also the fact that the United States government actually had a concerted effort to suppress the independence movement in Puerto Rico. There was a lot of repression. Right? But the fact is that at present, Puerto Rico also does not have a comparative advantage economically that would allow it to compete on equal footing with countries around in the region that would make it produce enough money to maintain the current standard of living, as poor as it may be. So they are afraid that they would regress. All right.
This concludes tonight's program. Please join me in thanking Dr. Vargas-Ramos.
Thank you. How do you like it?
I loved it. I thought it was great. So can you answer my question?